Hello, friends. I'm excited to speak today. I love speaking to this topic because I tend to work with a really enthusiastic population. Parents who care about their kids are always wanting to learn more and engage in this. So I love working with you guys. I know I look a little bit different than the picture in the UCAP thing. That was taken a couple of years ago, and since then I became Shaggy from Scooby-Doo, so that's why. If I wander around, hopefully the sound continues to carry. It sounds like it will. So I'm going to dig into porn-resilient relationships, and especially how we as parents respond to our kids when we discover that there is an issue involving pornography or other sexual problems. So I'm really excited to talk about this. As I do talk about it, I tend to be a little bit lighthearted about some of these things, but I want to acknowledge right up front that obviously this is a big issue. This is a really important thing, and it can involve really serious emotion, really big emotion, really painful emotion. And so hopefully bringing in some of the lightheartedness doesn't minimize those things, but instead allows us to laugh at ourselves a little bit and just recognize that we as parents are doing the best that we can. It's easy when we're talking about parenting ideals to get really carried away with the idea that we're not enough or we're not good parents. Hopefully this doesn't bring up any shame for you guys, but instead can inspire some action for you guys to take. So, and I should note too that these principles are sound, and oftentimes they can be difficult to implement into our family, and especially if the problems in our family are particularly severe or the situation is particularly complex. Just know that the implementation of some of these ideas may require the help of a family therapist. So let me start off just with a story to kind of illustrate what this can look like for families sometimes. So I was working with a family, and the mom actually had just sent her son in for therapy. He was a teenage guy, and he'd been kind of experimenting with not only pornography but with weed, and so she kicked his butt and sent him to therapy. And so he came in, and we were kind of exploring these ideas of like, so tell me a little bit more about the pornography and stuff like that. And so he talked about it, and he mentioned that when his mom first discovered that he had been viewing pornography, she set some restrictions on his phone. And naturally, his response was to find a way around those restrictions, right? And so she discovered that he'd found a way around the restrictions, and so she installed some pretty sophisticated filtering software. And then he learned a little bit of code and found his way around the software. So she took his phone away, and then he got a secret phone, and then she grounded him from, and it was just this back and forth. And by the time he came in, actually the problem had diminished a little bit because I think they were both so like exhausted and worn out that they'd both kind of given up on what they were fighting for. And it illustrates that, on the one hand, yes, boundaries are important, and actually they did help this guy eventually start to really pull away from the pornography and the weed. But so often this is the dynamic, and it's a little bit sad that sometimes getting the result of protecting our kids from pornography can cost us the relationship on accident. And so I want to talk about how we can do that without sacrificing the relationship. And in fact, I prioritize the relationship and make it really preeminent in kind of my approach. So well, I'll get to that in a little bit here. So let me start with some context. We're going to focus on parenting responses, but there's a lot that goes into this. So let me kind of illustrate what we can naturally do as parents if we're not careful. And I should highlight that this is an ineffective approach, so this isn't necessarily the one you want to mark down in your notes or anything. But as you can see, we've got this pyramid, and at the top, where many of us start naturally, is we warn our kids against the dangers and risks of pornography, and we highlight that it's bad, and if you get engaged with it, bad things can happen, and it can escalate from there. And then when exposure happens, because it naturally does, we can overreact because we've set ourselves up to avoid this, and when that doesn't work out, we can get really emotional, really upset. And so then we go to this third step down at the bottom here, and a lot of our time and a lot of our energy is then engaged in the battle against pornography, which accidentally becomes a battle against our kid in many cases. And so there is a better way. We don't want this pitched battle. When I worked with this kid, and after he kind of shared that back and forth with me, I just chuckled and asked him if he knew who Moriarty was. And I don't know if you guys know who Moriarty is, but think Sherlock Holmes, like your favorite iteration of Sherlock Holmes. It's the evil genius that matches Sherlock wit for wit. And they had kind of gotten in this battle, and I pictured that scene in that one movie where they're playing chess, you know what I mean? These two geniuses, just the battle of wits. It also made me think of Princess Bride, for those who are familiar. Right? Like, who's going to make the next move, and are we reacting in the way they expect us to react, and so on and so forth. Well, we want to avoid this dynamic, obviously. So I developed the porn resilient model, and for this, we start at the bottom of the pyramid, and just kind of symbolically, that's the base of things, and that's where I want families to spend most of their time and most of their energy, right? And so the first step is cultivating the relationship. Having a good relationship with your kid isn't enough in and of itself to prevent pornography problems. But man, if you did only one thing, I would want you to have a good relationship with your kid, even if they were struggling. It can be a huge resource to tap into. And so this is stuff like having fun with our kids, hanging out with them, talking with them, right? It also involves having good boundaries so that they can respect and understand the expectations that we have for them. And so this is where all that good parenting stuff comes in so that we can have a good relationship. As we do that, that frees us up to more effectively prepare our child. So this is where the age-appropriate education comes in, the skills building where we train them up in decision-making or emotional regulation, conflict management, those kinds of things. And we help cultivate different attributes that are going to be important for them as well: maturity, responsibility, resilience itself. And as we prepare our kids, they're learning and growing, and not just in the realm of pornography or sexuality, right? But in just all areas of life. These are huge foundational pieces for being successful and being resilient to pornography. So then this, of course, sets us up, and step 3 in this model is managing media. So this is where we get into having, maybe some of the filters or software comes into play right here, helps us manage it. But it's not just that, it's family rules, it's family culture, even the positive use of media. And so managing media is really huge because this day and age, of course, that's the avenue that this inappropriate sexuality can come into our lives. So managing media is really important. And then when we have all of those things in place, navigating exposure isn't such a huge thing, right? We can draw on those pre-existing resources. And so we spend some time and some energy navigating exposure when it happens. And that's what we're going to talk a little bit more, well, quite a bit more on navigating exposure in the specific element of parent responses today. But I highlight the model and kind of show where we are on the map. We're kind of jumping into step 4. And yet I would encourage everyone to really be paying attention to these underlying pieces. Your responses are going to be more successful if you pack in some of these other resources ahead of time. So I wanted to illustrate that context and let you guys know that kind of where we are on the map, like I said. So let's go ahead and dive into parenting responses. I'll start pretty general here. I'm sorry for all the memes. I'm a millennial, so I can't help it. So how do we respond? In general, we'll get into the specifics in a bit here. I want you to draw upon your inner Yoda, or you can insert your favorite mentor here, right? And what I mean by that is if you can be responding to this issue from your highest self, like the best version of you, especially the part of you that is filled with love, acceptance, When we respond with a tone of curiosity, when we infuse a little bit of humor in the situation, that can help immensely. And then I just love the idea of not crisis management, right? But using exposure to pornography as an opportunity to mentor our kids, to grow them up a little bit, to teach them a little bit more about how the world actually works. And so you can kind of be, the Yoda on Luke's back, just kind of like giving wisdom as they kind of go about their training and their tasks, right? So, like I said, we want to draw on our highest self, but of course, with the issue of pornography, it's so personal and can feel so important and so devastating that this can be really hard to do, as you guys know. And so I would strongly recommend taking the time that you need to get centered, right? In the moment of a response. So if you see something on the browsing history, or if you walk in and see something happening, or even if your kid kind of approaches you and kind of sits down on the side of the bed at night and just says, "Hey, Mom, Dad, I've got something I need to tell you." In any of those situations, we're going to have an immediate response, of course, right? But if you can tell that a lot of emotion is showing up and a lot of energy is coming into this scenario, I would actually encourage you to try and keep that initial encounter brief. Take some time to get centered as best as you can, and let's come back to this with that inner Yoda in play. So while you take this break, I would encourage you to talk with your support network and just let them know what's going on, right? Be careful who you talk with. You want to respect your kids' privacy, of course, but if there's some trusted people that can stay confidential with this, talk about what's going on. Process your initial emotions. What's the big, main reaction? Is it anger toward your kid? Is it shame for your own parenting? Is it disillusionment with God? Like whatever it might be, kind of process through that. See if you can sand off some of the rough edges, and then maybe even rehearse kind of what you want the response to be with your support network. So again, if we take the example of the horribly uncomfortable situation of you walk in and you see something that has happened, it may be as simple as just acknowledging, "Hey, please shut off the computer. I was just coming to tell you, dinner's ready, and I want to talk about this, but why don't we revisit this tomorrow night after we get a good night's rest and we, get home from work and school." It feels so urgent, like we've got to sit down and do it right then and right there. And if we're capable of it, that's great. But if we need a little bit of time. Now, I'm not saying, take a couple of years to train up and then come back to it. But let some of the initial gasoline burn off, right? So that we can come to this as centered as we can be. Okay, well, let's start taking a look at the specifics here. And this is what I call the parenting playbook. I didn't know we were going to have a general manager talking to us, so I don't know what he would think of this playbook, but I don't know if that works. I guess it doesn't work the same way in baseball as football, but you can imagine that scenario, right? Now, I understand that, of course, parenting doesn't take place in discrete plays, right, where we plan it out and then execute. There's a flow and a natural rhythm to it. And yet, I think organizing these in different plays, so to speak, actually helps us to see the underlying principles of these parenting ideas. And in fact, you may very well recognize yourself in some of these. So the way I organize it, I've got 6, and you can see it in the handout, I've got 6 plays that shut kids down, and then 6 plays that grow kids up. And I've paired them together, so number 1 correlates with number 1. So in other words, we've got ineffective parent responses, and then we've got an alternative effective parenting response. And I'll try and make that clear, the connections. So hopefully the way my brain organized this works for you guys, okay? Yeah, please, if you didn't get a handout, please put your hand up and we can get one to you. Okay, so let's jump in. Here's the hammer. I don't know why, but I giggle every time I see this picture just because he's got such a wimpy hammer. Sometimes I try and be, confrontational in like group therapy or something like that. And then I'll like backpedal and apologize. And everybody's like, it wasn't that mean in the first place, Taylor. So, but the hammer, you probably, even just that title kind of gives you a clue what we're talking about here. You might know exactly what this is. So the hammer, this play is all about responding with anger with an emphasis on punishment. And if we had a rationale to this, we don't always. Sometimes we're just emotionally reacting. But if we had a logical thought process behind this, it would probably go something like, hey, if I punish this bad behavior, it will go away, right? And I don't know, there's something to that, but at the same time, it's kind of a sloppy implementation of it. So what actually happens when we do play out the hammer, when we drop the hammer, does the behavior go away? Usually the effect is actually one of fear for our kids, like they don't like being around us. They'll probably get resentful. A lot of kids will rebel and push back when they've got a parent that's confronting pretty hard on things. Or some will go the opposite direction and try to and please their parents and kind of go the perfectionism route of like, I won't let you down again kind of idea. And then a lot of times, maybe the most common thing is the response is not, okay, I'll stop the behavior. It's, okay, I'm not going to get caught next time. I'm going to level up my sneakiness, right? So we want to be really careful with that. For those who can't read, Thor's pretty angry right here. He says, it says, when Thor throws his hammer, he is serving justice. When I throw a hammer, I have anger management issues, right? And so why do we do this as parents? Well, maybe part of that is we have maybe some skills deficit in working with anger for ourselves. Maybe this isn't an emotion that we're familiar with or have a good mastery over. Or there might be control issues. If you're like me, when things don't go according to plan, you kind of freak out a little bit in any way you can. So that's a good indication of control issues. I think most of us have those. And it's also possible, why do we do this? Well, maybe positive discipline wasn't really modeled for us as parents, as children when we were growing up. Maybe we just didn't see it. Maybe we don't know how it's supposed to go. Regardless of the reason, you can tell that this hammer approach, it is trying to get to something important, right? It is saying like, hey, this is not okay, but the strategy to eliminate the problem is just not effective. And so here's the alternative that we want to pursue instead, the line in the sand. And so what I mean by this is a response of establishing boundaries and setting up limitations. It's good to expect discipline and certain standards from our kids, right? Research shows that good parenting involves a lot of what's called demandingness, which sounds a little bit harsh, but it's just simply the idea that something is expected of the participants in this family, right? We have to be a baseline civility here. I've got a 3-year-old, so we haven't gotten that one yet. She can be pretty savage sometimes, but we're working on it. So the line on the sand, the distinction here, because we're still addressing the behavior, but the distinction is that we draw the line in the sand in a moment of calm when our brain is focused on what is best for my child, not I'm super TO'd here. So we clarify the expectation, and we might even clarify what happens if that expectation is not met, like how we would respond if this continues to happen. And that kind of a boundary, rather than an angry reaction, is really, really constructive for kids. The rationale here is that kids thrive when they have structure, when they have routines, and when there's a certain level of structure in their lives, right? Again, research just backs that up. We need some of that in our lives. Now, the effect on the kid, if we draw the line in the sand, they probably will grumble, especially if you come away from UCAP and then you sit the family down and you're like, all right, we got some rules. And they're like, what are rules? What do you mean? They're probably going to have some grumbling, right, and some pushback. And in most cases, that's going to be a temporary season, and then kids will adapt to that and then kind of start to appreciate, all right, yeah, this feels better. I work with young men launching into independence a lot of times, and there's one guy who's just like so resistant to working out, and so, but we finally got him to go do some light workouts. He's like, he complains so hard, and then he's kind of like, all right, it's not that bad. It kind of feels good, I guess, you know. And that's what happens a lot of times for our kids. Now, not always. Sometimes a defiance pattern really shows up strongly here. This might be one of those situations where you need the guidance of a therapist to kind of help work through tricky situations. But once we get those positive routines in place, development can start to develop. You know what I mean. Kids will grow up, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. And it provides a certain amount of safety. When we have a house with the expectations clearly outlined, the world is predictable and ordered for kids, and they feel like it's safe. So this is really positive, really constructive. So to make the shift from, like, if you've got a tendency toward the hammer and you want to make the shift into drawing the line in the sand, take a look at those anger and control issues. You might have some personal work, and that might be self-help. It might be some therapy or something like that. And then I would even recommend taking a look at some parenting education and getting some of those basic ideas on positive discipline and so forth. And you might think, you know, because I teach on this stuff, that I would already know all these things, but when my daughter enters into a new phase, my wife and I are always going back to the basics and kind of rethinking through, okay, how does it work in this phase of things, right? And so this might just be one of those situations where we kind of go back to those fundamental ideas of good parenting and see how they work in this scenario. Okay, next one, the guilt trip. You guys probably know this one, right? We've all got that person in our lives that's just like too good at shaming us. And we know that shuts us down, so it should be no surprise that this will also shut kids down. So this is a response of shaming. And we often, you know, I don't think many parents like use this as an intentional strategy of like, okay, I'm going to shame my child so that, you know, they shape up. But a lot of times we kind of don't know what else to do. So we go about highlighting just how wrong and bad the behavior was. And often when we have the wrong tone or the wrong energy or the wrong timing on this, the implication for our kid is clear. It's not that the behavior was so bad, it's that they themselves are bad, right? And so we need to be very careful. Even if we're trying to focus on the behavior, we have to make sure that emotionally they're kind of registering with our intentions there. So the rationale here is that, hey, maybe if our kids feel bad, they'll stop, right? And again, there's something to this, right? There is the role of guilt in correcting behavior, but this implementation of just kind of laying on the shame is not going to be helpful. I was working with a guy who was working on some issues, and he was preparing to go on an LDS mission, and his mom and he came in, and they actually had a really, like the pyramid that you guys saw, they had a lot of those foundational pieces in place. They had open communication, and he was reporting on slips with his mom quite openly. They had a really good relationship, and yet we were kind of stuck in terms of working through the slips. And so we were digging into the relationship aspect between him and his mom, and he told me, like, yeah, you know, every time I tell my mom, like, she's great, she loves me, but she has that look, right? And I was like, what do you mean? Well, he's like, you know, the look, right? And I think he literally did air quotes. And so he told me about it, and he gave me the look. I was like, oh, yeah, that's quite a look, right? So we brought his mom in to work with him, and I supported him in talking about how this made him feel and all of that. And they did great work. This family did incredible hard therapeutic work. And she started to recognize, oh, okay. And she was a pretty humorous person, and they had a good buddy-buddy relationship. And so I think she thought he was interpreting that as like, come on, dude. But she still had a lot of love behind it. But it wasn't interpreted that way, and that helped him start to ease up on some of his own internal shame as well. So sometimes this is very accidental. And obviously here the effects, you know, are shame, guilt, right? And what do you do when you've got that critical boss or mother-in-law or whoever it is, right? When you know that they're always going to kind of point out the things that you do wrong, we avoid them, right? We see them in the grocery store and we kind of go down the healthy food aisle even though we have nothing to get there, right? So we avoid, our kids are going to do the same thing. So why do we do this? Well, a lot of us, we do have a good and maybe important kind of disgust with the behavior, and that might be a little bit strong for some, maybe not strong enough for others. But there is something about this behavior that does kind of bring out that reaction in us, and that makes good sense. We may be unsure what else to do other than just like point out like, hey, that's bad, that's wrong, right? So here's the alternative, and this one is actually a really tricky play. This is going to take some time and practice to develop if you're kind of starting from scratch here. So give yourself a little bit of grace. But there's a play I call The Reckoning. And this is where we focus on asking questions to encourage self-reflection for our kids. And their self-reflection is critical to them growing up. I'm not going to go into what mindfulness is, but if there are some of you that are already familiar with that concept, you can connect the dots here, right? We're trying to foster some mindfulness for our kids. If you're not sure what that is, you should learn about it. It's a good thing. I just did a podcast. It'll air in a little bit for Meridian Magazine, the Illuminate podcast on mindfulness. That could be a resource to kind of get you started. It's kind of an intro to mindfulness. But the idea here is that we're helping our child tune into their emotions and start to pay attention to what's naturally happening inside of them, okay? The rationale here is that heeding guilt and fear actually can be growth promoting for us. It can help us to make changes. So the effect here, if we're effectively getting our children to self-reflect, to tune in and kind of work with their natural emotions, hopefully they can get to a point where they can experience some healthy guilt, right? Like recognizing, oh yeah, there is that part of me that's saying this is wrong. If I pay attention to that part, like, maybe I do need to respond and try and do things differently. Some of you guys probably don't know what healthy guilt is, so just trust me that it's real, right? We're pretty good at shaming ourselves in our culture, but healthy guilt, right? When we notice our behaviors are not lining up with our values, it's the inspiring feeling, the painful but inspiring feeling that gets us to line things back up. And that's very possible for our kids, right? And so helping them notice what's happening for them and follow those promptings to like, oh, I got to make this right. You know what I mean? And if we can do that, then our kids tend to be cooperative and willing to engage with accountability. So making the shift from the guilt trip to the reckoning, we want to focus on asking and listening, right? And I mean literally in a conversation, keep reminding yourself, okay, questions, ask questions, right? What are they saying? What are they? Let me listen and understand what they are feeling. As we invite that out of them and kind of try and get the energy to flow toward us instead of from us to them, what happens is that we learn and understand more, and our kids are putting it out there, and then they can, you know how it is, like when you like have something inside and then you finally talk about it, and then you're like, oh, now I can put all the pieces together and make sense of this. It's the same for our kids, and this helps grow them up. And then this does require a little bit of trust that our kids can do this, and maybe they can't right now. Some of you are saying like, not my kid, right? They can't really make sense of their emotions. And I don't know, maybe that's true for right now, actually. But as you continue to invite self-reflection and cultivate this idea of paying attention to our emotions is really important, over time they can develop this skill, right? So to help yourself make the shift, you might take a look at empathy education and learn a little bit more about what that is, how it works. You might learn more about emotional intelligence or soft skills or things like that help you kind of have these conversations. As I mentioned, this can be a tough one to get to, but it's really, really important. Okay. You can probably read that one. That's pretty big. Something will die today. That is a fearsome cat. We know this feeling, don't we, right? So this is the witch hunt, okay? And so when we see that something bad has happened for our kid, the mama bear can come out. And this is all about retaliating. And we might focus our efforts on attacking some external sources, right? You know, the porn industry, for example, or our kid's friend, or our kid's friend's parent, or maybe just all men ever, right? We find some group or category to go after, and that can feel pretty good because, you know, we're using up our adrenaline, and the rationale might be something along the lines of, I can clear away the contagions so that this doesn't have to happen again. And yeah, I guess like if we actually could, then that would be true, I suppose. But this is the kind of thing that's that we just have to kind of reckon with and deal with. We can't kind of have that one-man mission to remove the sex drive from the human race, right? We just have to learn how to work with this in an effective way. So the effects on our kids, they can often feel embarrassed, right? That scene in the Christmas Story where he swears and he's chewing on some soap, and then his mom starts screaming at the kid. Anyway, it brings that up to mind. So I've got so many pop culture references. I don't know what my problem is. Hopefully you're relating to most of them. I don't know. So the effects are that, they can be really embarrassed. They can also end up feeling really alone. They can feel guilty, and they can feel really unsupported in this situation. And here's what I mean by this. There's this story. You may have heard a similar version. I'm paraphrasing perhaps horribly, but this is a fictional story, so don't get too anxious. But we've got two kids. They decide to go on a hike one day, so they hike up in the mountains, and I picture the mountains of St. George where I'm from. So it's beautiful, hot, sandy rocks, and they're hiking along, and they hear this sound, and they're not sure what it is. So like curious boys, they go and investigate, and they find a rattlesnake rattling its tail, and one of the boys gets bitten by the snake. And so the other boy is kind of panicking, and he knows that this is a big deal. They know exactly what that is and what this can imply. And so he grabs a stick, and he chases down the snake, and it takes him a while, but he finally catches up to it. He beats it down, and the threat is eliminated. And by the time he comes back to his friend is quickly expiring. And of course, he realizes that his energy ought to have been spent helping get his friend off the mountain or calling 911, something like that, rather than chasing down the snake. For our kids, when they are using pornography or have accidentally run into pornography, they're very much like that kid on the mountain, curled up and wounded. And when we start putting our spotlight somewhere else, they're left in the dark. And that's not a situation we want to put our kids in, right? We want to be right there. We want to be focused first and foremost on helping them out. So why do we do this? Well, of course, we are protective. We care about our kids. This one's pretty understandable for many of us, I think. And there really is this urgency, this feeling of urgency to react and do something quick, right? So that kind of drives us. The alternative here is to join the movement. And I would guess here at UCAP, many of you guys are already kind of part of that, right? Maybe you're playing this one out already. So this response is still about making changes in the outside world. And we try and help individuals and families and communities and so forth. The rationale here is that focused, wise action can improve people. It can improve the world around us, right? So joining the movement is really important. And let me distinguish. The main difference here is one of timing and one of energy, right? So this may not be a play that you implement on the side of the bed when you're first hearing about it, right? You're not going to first hear about this and then say, all right, son, we're going to start a blog, We're going to do this right now. This comes a little bit later, right? So it's an issue of timing, so that we first focus on kind of our kids and what's most important. It's also the energy. This one's about, it may not be driven so much by rage or desperation, but instead by perhaps hope or a sense of purpose or something like that. And if we're playing this one out, our kids can feel really empowered. They can see, hey, you know what? We can make a difference in the world around us. They feel like maybe this isn't such a hopeless thing after all, right? They can feel some hope and maybe even a feeling of involvement themselves. So to make the shift, lean into patience, right? And as I mentioned, first and foremost, stabilize yourself. Get your inner Yoda ready to go, right? Stabilize the family. And I'm not saying like, get everybody ship shape. Our families are kind of probably never going to match our personal ideal, but get things stabilized, right? And then use this as an opportunity to kind of figure out what your unique strengths are, what your calling or purpose might be, and how you could uniquely contribute to the movement. I think that's where this becomes most powerful, and this is when the world benefits the most, is when you know what it is that you have to offer. Okay, the pact of silence. So, pretty self-explanatory. This response is when something shows up and we just don't do anything about it. We don't talk about it. And I've had a lot of guys in recovery talk about, when they were first discovered with pornography. Some of them got the, hey, just wait till your dad comes home, and then, mom and dad probably are talking about it in the bedroom, and then the kid's like nervously waiting in his bedroom, like, what's going to happen? And he waits and gets bored, so he's, pulls out the comic book or what, and like just nothing ends up happening. And so the rationale here could be one of two things. Number one, many parents don't view pornography as a problem, of course, and so they might be like, well, what is there to talk about? Isn't this what kids do, right? For you guys, I'm kind of assuming you're bought into the idea that it's an issue. So the rationale here might be that we're afraid to talk about it because it'll make things more uncomfortable, right? That awkwardness. But while we might spare our kids some awkwardness, the effect is that this leaves them very confused in many cases, and they can develop a false sense of permission, of like, well, nothing bad happened, so I kind of felt like I was in trouble, but maybe I'm really not. Maybe this isn't a big deal, right? So again, why do we react this way? Well, maybe we believe that it's not a big deal. We might have some distress intolerance, meaning, hey, it's just really hard for us to step into tense situations or conflict, or we might not know what to say. And that can be huge when I feel like a lot of families I talk to, they feel pretty lost as to like, where do we even start? How do we talk about this stuff? And so that can be a genuine reason. So we've got some empathy for this one, right? And yet it's not going to get us the result that we ultimately want of growing our kids up. So instead we pursue the emperor's new clothes. So some of you might be familiar with this story. It's like an Aesop's fable or something like that. Like a fairy tale, I don't know. All I know is that I grew up watching the Muppet version of this. So we've got, Fozzie Bear, who's the emperor, and he's got an important event, so there's going to be a huge parade, and so he hires a tailor to make him the finest cloth, and so this tailor sees an opportunity for a great con. So he sets up the loom, he starts weaving this cloth, and the emperor comes in, and he's like, you have nothing on the loom, what's going on? And so the tailor says, no, take a look, this is a really, really unique, rare cloth, and only those who are wise can see this cloth. And so, the emperor, he sees nothing, but he doesn't want to admit to being a fool, so oh yeah, okay, I see what you're saying. Oh yeah, it's gorgeous, and all the attendants, have to kind of go along with it as well. The word spreads that this is, being made, and so the whole village is prepared. and the day of the parade, nobody sees it, and Fozzie Bear's walking around in his fur, and everybody's just pretending because they don't want to be the one to admit that, they're a fool when everybody else obviously sees it. And it's not until one boy sees Fozzie Bear and he's like, guys, he's not wearing any clothes. And so everybody assumes he's a fool, but then people start to vouch for him, like, no, this is a really bright kid, actually. And pretty soon there is a reverse ripple where everybody starts to acknowledge, well, I don't really see it either, and I'm not that dumb, So it kind of goes back. The point of this story is that it took the courage of a young boy to speak up and say something that nobody else was talking about, right? To call it out as it was. And that's what we need to do. So this is all about jumping into dialogue and discussing with our kids. So start tackling these uncomfortable issues. The rationale here is that loving communication is always going to be beneficial. And if you do run into temporary discomfort, it's worth it, right? So there may be some discomfort, but also a lot of relief. And this is where, when you start to talk about it, this is where you can train up your kids in problem-solving skills. So making the shift, go ahead and acknowledge that it feels awkward. Sometimes that's enough to break the ice, and go for it anyway, and you'll kind of figure it out together, right? And it's also possible, I know I feel more prepared, or I feel more confident when I'm prepared, when I have knowledge. So maybe this really does require an investment of time. Listen to podcasts, read books, whatever it might be, so you have some of the initial thoughts on, like, how do I talk about this, okay? And go back to that pyramid idea of step one, cultivating the relationship, right? If you can open up the relationship in other ways, sometimes you can bring that into this category. Okay, the Sermon on the Couch. You probably can't read the caption. It says, when you tell your parents a funny story, and it turns into a life lesson. That's so good. This kid's awesome. The Sermon on the Couch. So this is, the talking, the teaching, the preaching, the lectures, and this is marked by it's a one-sided conversation. The energy is going from parent to child. Okay, this is not really going to help. We know that this shuts kids down. And the rationale might be if I convince them of their errors, then they will change. But the reality, of course, is that no, if they're paying attention at all, it'll probably cultivate a sense of shame and moral depravity, right? Like, I keep screwing up. Like, I keep getting these lectures because I'm just not doing it right. Probably more commonly, they just don't listen, right? And so they'll get annoyed with us, resentful, and they'll start to avoid us. So this is not the direction we want to go. Why do we do this? Well, there is a natural desire to teach, of course. We may be afraid of listening and understanding. And by that, I don't mean like we're like scared of those things, but we might have kind of this mental concept of the corrupt information is in my child, the correct information is me. We need to flush that out. And it kind of causes us to get our energy that way. I would invite you to take the risk of allow them to open up, and even if their ideas are a little bit skewed, by bringing them up, your kids get to reflect on them, and that's where you can start to help gently nudge them in a different direction. The vision quest is the alternative here, and by this, I've kind of got that image of the young Indian brave treading away from the tribe, going out to find his place in the world, make observations of who he is, nature, how that works, and who he's going to become. And we want kind of a similar process for our kids. So this is still emphasizing values and standards for our children. We want them to be conscientious. But the difference here is that the vision quest is causing our kids to develop this for themselves. So we're the Yoda, right, trying to mentor them along and trying to tap into what's important to our kids. How do they view the world? How do they want to lead their own lives, right? So the rationale here is that when they make a decision for themselves, how they want to conduct their lives, what matters most to them, they're going to start making really good decisions. So the effects here, they'll mature, they'll become more independent, they'll start making better decisions. And so to make this shift, we want to, again, focus on questions. There's some similarity with the reckoning, as you can probably see, and discovering what our kids believe in, what they think, and it can be a little bit scary when that's a little different from what we think and feel and believe. And yet, and yet encouraging them to take a look at those things, that's how those things start to grow up for them. So I actually recommend personality assessments in this situation a lot of times, because personality assessments are kind of often built on that notion of, hey, there are just different types of people, and we want to figure out which type we are, which type our kid is. And all of a sudden, differences are not so threatening when we see that we all have strengths and weaknesses and we all have a role. And so when we can see that, hey, the way I view the world is going to naturally be different than the way my kid views the world in certain ways, that can be okay. Now, you'll find, too, that they'll still adopt some of the specific standards and things that you have, but they're going to be buying into it more deeply if it's tuning into their own sense, their own personal value system. Okay, the next one, the hot mess. This is when, as a parent, we're encountering overwhelming emotion, sadness, anger, that kind of thing. And a lot of times the emphasis is on the parent's pain in this scenario. So I worked with a guy, and his mom and him had already done some good work, and then they continued to do good work by the time they came in to see me. But he still remembered how wounding it was when his mom first discovered his pornography use. And he was in the bedroom, and she was just weeping, and like, I'm disappointed. How could you do this? And it was really scary for him. The effect on him was that, wow, I did something huge, and I just did a lot of damage. I must be a really, really bad person. And if I want to keep people feeling good, I probably need to stay away and withdraw a little bit. And so the rationale, again, we're probably not using a logical line of thinking. The emotions might just be taking over. But if they see how much this hurts me, they'll stop. But the effect is actually one where our kids can feel really defective or unworthy. Again, that shame. And this can cause kids to shut down. That dog is so sad and so cute. It's heartbreaking. So why do we do this? I've got a ton of empathy for this one, right? A lot of times, we as parents just care very much. And often we have our own trauma. We have our own history with the pains that can be associated with sexual misconduct. And so a lot of times this is rooted in trauma and fear for what could happen if we're not careful. So this is a really understandable place to go, okay? The alternative here is the white flag. So this conjures up an image of acceptance, surrender, right? And if you can get to this place of conveying acceptance of your child despite their mistakes, this can be huge for your kids. The rationale here is that encountering darkness, encountering trials and challenges is universal. It's going to happen, and it can also be the means by which we make sense of this world and grow up. So when we convey this sense of acceptance of, hey, I'm okay, you're okay, it can cultivate a good felt sense of emotional safety. And it can help our kids become more confident, and they can feel worthy even though they make mistakes. So to make the shift, this is where it gets really tricky, because those emotions are so real and so powerful. And as you know, if you're dealing with your own history and your own trauma, that can take years of healing. And so to make the shift, this is perhaps a long-term thing, and pursue healing, grieve what needs to be grieved. The loss of that image that you had for your child's life, maybe it's going to look a little bit different than you thought. Go ahead and grieve that loss. That will free you up to be more, to more embrace who your child is becoming, even if it's not what you had wanted for them. Okay, so to quickly kind of summarize the principles here, we're going to shut our kids down if we're involving a lot of strong emotion, if a lot of our energy is toward our kids, from us toward our kids, if we're focused on fixing too much too quickly, and if the emphasis is on what we as parents do, right? That can shut kids down a lot. On the other hand, kids will grow up when we can hold their emotions with love, when we listen, focus on understanding them, and bring that energy toward us, draw it out of them toward us. When we are inviting reflection, and when we collaborate solutions and child action. Here, I mean, we kind of do want our kids to do some of the work, right? nothing grows us up like being responsible for something. And so we want them to be doing some things about this if we can if we can encourage them to, right? So let me mention that obviously complex family situations, as I mentioned, that can make these really difficult, and yet hang on to these principles. And some of you are thinking like, man, I wish I could have run through these ideas 2 weeks ago, right? Or 2 years ago. Just know that you can repair, right? This is not like an impossible thing to recover from. If you broke down and you were a hot mess with your kid the first time that you discovered their pornography use, I would communicate with your kid directly and just say like, hey, I acknowledge that I didn't handle it well that one time. I'm trying to do better. Here's what I want to do in the future, right? And work with the resources that you have. And if these things are tricky, always go back to the relationship itself. Have a little more quality time, have a little more fun, maybe increase the discipline and the boundaries a little bit. And as you improve the relationship, it's going to make these things more available for you guys. So for those who are interested in these ideas and the porn resilient model, you can go to my website, taylorjchambers.com. And I've got a free assessment with a bunch of questions. You can kind of give yourself a score on how things are going in your family, and it will guide you through a process of figuring out your next steps, like which areas to focus on. And so that will help kind of take these general ideas and help you zero in on what you can do to improve your family in the short term. So that's a great resource, the family assessment. And then I also run a 4-week parenting workshop. The next one is coming up in a couple of weeks, March 8th, Friday, March 8th. A Friday evening, and we just do it for 4 Fridays in a row. And we do a deep dive into each of those 4 steps of the porn resilient model. So if you're interested in learning more, go ahead and look for that on the website as well. And it's the last gift of the day, I promise. So thank you so much. You guys are trying to help your families, heal your families, and I don't know. Honestly, parents that care this much are really important. This world needs people like you. So thank you so much. Appreciate it.